You make pretty regrettable mistakes when you're desperate. Unfortunately, desperation would go on to cost me much more than I ever thought possible. When I was 19 years old, my financial situation wasn't great. In what was left of a crumbling home would be my recovering addict twin sister, and myself. The unfortunate state of our home was all from the even more unfortunate passing of our parents just 4 years prior. The two hadn't died tragically by any means, thankfully. No. Our parents died of old age, a consequence of having us kids later in life, while not being able to take on the financial burden that would be us. My sister was making the early steps into the college lifestyle, doing her best to stay afloat with my support in funding. Money was tight for the two of us, but as she became more well off on her own, the more content she was with severing the last remaining tie to her childhood. Me. I didn't hate Zell for her decision. If anything, I understood her distancing from this life, even if it saddened me. So then it was just me, left to a house with a hole in the ceiling. Believe it or not, life wasn't all too bad, even with how considerably down in the dumps it otherwise seemed to be. However, content as I might have been, it's human nature to want more than you have. Can't say I was too greedy to look for some comfortability in my own home. And so there it was. The glistening letters of ink outlining my salvation. An advertisement I'd found plastered onto the wall of the small booth I sat at while I waited for the bus to carry me off to work. $5,000 to those compatible for a recent scientific breakthrough. Under any normal circumstances I would consider this a scam. Hell, I was skeptical as I scanned the letters. Had I been told of this opportunity through spam call or text, I would have glossed right over it just as anyone else would have. But I was desperate. I think it was the fact that some real person had to have put this paper up on this wall gave me some glimmer of hope for a quick cash grab. Listed below the promise of money was details for a number to call regarding interest in the proposition. I took the bait. I saw the line, and like some idiot I clamped my teeth down just for that hook to sweep me away. The corporation I'd come to know as the Ars Action would see me just a week later. There was a brief consultation. They took my weight, age, all things I would have expected. It wasn't until they pulled records regarding my familial situation that I began to find this whole ordeal suspicious. To begin to find things suspicious only at this point is foolish, something I full understand, but I feel the need to reinforce the fact that I, Lex McCarthy, was desperate. Everything by this point seemed pretty legit. The blood tests, the doctor's office, the tests were reasonable. What was I to suspect? Everything was so vague, and truth be told I honestly didn't even expect anything to come of this visit. All the doctors, all the consultants seemed so disinterested in my features. But when they realized I had no one, everything seemed to change. Suddenly ears perked, suddenly doors closed, suddenly I was exactly what they were looking for. Every feature of myself was so painfully average. I was anyman, I was nothing. Despite their best efforts to be discreet, I knew it was only the fact that nobody would come looking for me that piqued their interests. My stomach dropped when I was faced with a pen in my hand, trembling over that NDA. Every fiber of me cursed myself for never considering putting just a minute of research into the ARS action, however a video briefing would ease my nerves. Nobody knew who the ARS action was. There was no public record of their existence, and that NDA would make sure that they continued to never exist. I was stupid, I was irrational, I was in over my head. But I was desperate. And I had nothing else. I have nothing else. I have nothing else. It was a mantra I chanted as I was injected with that substance. The substance that turned my blood orange, made my skin freakishly thin. And then I went home. That was it. I was given my sum of money, and I was sent home. They told me I was good to go, and no number of questions would get a one of them to speak. I was only met with who I'd assumed to be security guiding me out of the building. Not a word more of what I'd just been injected with, only given instructions to not dwell on mirrors for too long. That was it, just some ominous instructions. So I left, as befuddled as I arrived. Relief washed over me as I made my way home. The anxiety I'd received from such an ominous build-up was all waived by the fact that I was somehow just good to go. Relief quickly turned to panic as the inherent nature of it all being too good to be true set in. I expected to die, I expected some visit from government agents, I expected anything and everything, but as months turned to years, nothing ever came of it. No mirror ever caused me any harm, which was its own anxiety I'd have to overcome simply because of the absurd nature or such a request. I hoped it was some prank. Everything was well, for a time. Of course, to disturb my peace, my sister called. I just watched the phone ring. My sister, someone who I hadn't spoken to in upwards of 8 years, was suddenly ringing me up. When I finally had answered, her question left me speechless. "Hey Lex, would you happen to remember Mom's recipe for that egg toast? I think I left the cookbook at your place." I felt my ears ring. The question was so casual. She entirely skipped the part where we discussed how she's been, how I'm doing. She spoke to me like we'd hung out only days ago. At the time I'd thought I was just being dramatic, but looking back on it I can only justify my own hesitation to respond. What? I stammered like a fool, but I was firm in my disbelief. "Yeah, it should be in the book on the counter." I looked over my shoulder to my kitchen counter, past the toaster I never bought, and over to the book she spoke of. My jaw hung heavy, the whole interaction feeling like a dream. With one hand I held the phone, and with the other I began to skim the pages of the book, letting my eyes linger on Mom's cinnamon roll recipe for a bit longer than intended. "Lex, are you okay?" my sister inquired on the other end. I suddenly felt sick, falling to the ground and laying on my back. This wasn't happening. "Lex, are you all right?" My sister repeated back more urgently, followed by her assurance that she would be over soon to check on me. But no company ever arrived. After hours the line just dropped, and I fell asleep there on that cold, wooden floor, paralyzed with a feeling I couldn't wrap my head around. When I finally gathered the composure to stand, I would try to call Zell back. A frown dawned my face when she never answered. Somehow this didn't surprise me, and I was led to believe that she had never called me in the first place. The thing is, the book was still on my counter, and her call was still logged on my phone. Still, I hadn't known Zell to do something like this. It wasn't in her nature to do something so cruel, to act like all this time hadn't passed. But it has. Years have gone by and nothing but radio silence from her, a silence I feared would go on. The following days I would continue to attempt to call her, but to no avail. I had to come to terms with the fact that, as quickly as she had returned to my life, Zell was once again gone. I'm ashamed to admit that, just as I'd forgotten that experience with the Ars action several years ago, I'd forgotten about my own sister. Even if she wouldn't call back, I was inspired to begin looking through old family pictures, and this is where the oddities would start to fester. I found a picture of Zell and I just eating breakfast. Usually my mom was off to work by then, but it was a special occasion. It was a day I remember so vividly. I was 14 years old at this time, and had awoke to the sweet smell of cinnamon rolls filling the air. After all, it was Zell's and I's birthday. All was right with the world, all as I climbed from the messy sheets in my dark room. It was abundantly clear that the bulb of the light beside my bed had burned out over the course of the night, and the closed blinds didn't aid my vision as I stumbled around my room in search of my door. An oddity presented itself in the fashion of aimless wondering. Where was the knob? One I'd become so accustomed to. Not needing to open? I'd never closed my door. Not the previous night, not ever. Not to the behest of my mother, who'd always taken annoyance to closed doors, some trait of my grandmother's to which my mom had unfortunately inherited. Breakfast took the form of 2 strips of bacon, scrambled eggs, and slightly burnt French toast. My previous assumption of cinnamon rolls unfortunately missed the mark, however I wouldn't object to this. I wish I could convince myself that I was wrong. Something so mundane, something so insignificant to the events in this story, however, the first notable instance of a curse that I couldn't pinpoint. My mother had already seen herself off to work by this point, and so I was faced with the responsibilities of seeing myself out to the bus. Some routine I'd become far too used to. The minutes passed, leaving me with nothing to do but wait by the door for a bus that would never arrive. If the door being shut and the cinnamon rolls being a different meal entirely had left me with a minor confusion, then suddenly being seated in the passenger seat of my mother's car listening to the nonchalant complaints from my twin sister about the nuances freshman year math shot me into a disarray I couldn't possibly quantify. I think one of the scariest things for me is the fact that I thought nothing of it. I hadn't freaked out. No scene. was made to express what should have been one of the more disturbing instances of my childhood. I could chalk up the mistaking breakfast for something else as me just misremembering events. But something unmistakable is the fact that somehow my mom both never drove me to school, yet the fact that she always had. If you're confused, I understand. I am too, because the contradicting nature of my memory is something that haunts me to no end. Things were easier as a child. That's often the case, but ever since I stopped aging, I've begun to notice the oddities presented by life that are inexplainable. I'm not even sure where to start with researching my predicament. The Mandela effect is something that I feel needs no introduction. To those who don't know, the Mandela effect, in brief, is a phenomenon that occurs when you misremember something. Think of a card. Now imagine you saw that card as a child and it had a single heart drawn on its center. Now, years later you are discussing this card with someone else just for them to tell you that the heart you swear, the heart you know you saw, was a diamond. You tell them they are wrong, you shake your head, chuckle nervously. But then they present you with the card. Your stomach drops. This can't be the card, there is no way. Only it is the card, and when you come to the realization that it is in fact the card you'd seen as a child, you are filled with a mix of confusion, fascination, and quite possibly denial. Most often, the Mandela effect is associated with silly things like books titles, and board game mascots, but my experience is far beyond such things. It's the only phenomenon I've found that seems even within the realm of explaining my predicament. Problem is, the more I think, the more is wrong. All of me wishes it all ended with that one childhood experience. But it didn't. In fact, the more I consider my childhood, the more contradictions I notice. Part of me believes I could handle this if it was limited to my childhood, but it's not. This experience, it affects my everyday. I'm not losing my mind, I'm just picking up crumbs that I never dropped. Not losing my mind, just finding more mind than the inventory should account for. As I stop and think now, I'm understanding that my memories are overlapping. Other mirrored versions of myself and my memories will occasionally cross paths, and when they do it causes me to misremember. Not because I don't remember, but because my memories conflict with one another. I wish I could see someone about this, but I'm worried the consequences of me seeking someone out. Still, we make dumb mistakes when we are desperate, and I'm starting to feel desperate again.